Now, I truly believe that being able to thrive in this fast-changing world of work, you need to be able to look around the corners and look what kind of trends are impacting how we live, we work, we act, and we interact. And we are now at the beginning of the year. We're recording this at the beginning of 2021, and everyone is interested. What's ahead this year? What are the trends? What do I need to know in order to prepare for work and to thrive in this work? But today, I'm super excited to be joined by a special guest who is not just looking around the corner what's happening this year, but has a longer term vision as to what the future of work looks like. Today we are joined by Jeff Wald, who is also the author of The End of Jobs. And we are super excited to dig in as to what is the future of work? What does it mean for us as individual contributor, but also from a HR perspective and organizational perspective? What do we need to prepare for? And what can we do straight away to strive in this fast changing world of work? Now, with no further ado, welcome, Jeff.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm super excited to have you here. Now, can you give us a little bit of a background as to who are you, what are you doing, and how did you get to where you're now?
Well, I guess the who am I? That's a deep question. It's deep. It's deep. I think I'll just stick with some professional stuff, and maybe as the conversation evolves, we'll get down to some deeper things about who is Jeff Wald. I have started a few tech companies. The most recent is a company called Work Market, which is enterprise software that enables companies to manage their freelance population. As the on-demand workforce continues to grow, our software was increasingly important for companies around the world in managing this important part of their labor force. And so 3 years ago, we were fortunate enough to sell the company to ADP. And in the sale to ADP, I was able to get some of the space that I needed to finally finish this book that I had been writing for 7 years about the future of work. And the point of the book is to look at history, is to look at data, is to look at how companies actually engage workers and deploy capital in order to have a framework for making a prediction about the future of work. Because people that are out there saying, oh, well, the workforce is going to be this or going to be that in this number of years or that number of years, that don't look at history, that don't look at data, and don't think about how companies actually engage workers, those predictions are kind of meaningless in my view.
I love this approach to also look backwards because there's always something that we can learn from it. And I didn't realize you've been writing this book for 7 years. And the book got published mid 2020, so in the midst of a pandemic. And all of those predictions, quote unquote, that you've seen coming, it's actually nothing new. It's just been fast tracked. Now, can you talk us through a little bit about your findings and what exactly is the future of work?
Well, I'll tell you, it's as with anything in the world of work, it is just incredibly complex, and any simple explanation, any simple statement belays the mass complexity that goes into it. What I'll tell you we can learn from history is that we have been here before. Companies, workers, and society have had to adjust to huge technological changes in the production of goods and services. And it's important that we study this because we're in the early stages of what some are calling the fourth industrial revolution with robots and AI. So how do we not look at how companies, workers, and societies adapted in the first three? I'm not saying it's going to happen exactly the same, but history tells us that it's got a pretty darn good chance of rhyming. So one of the things, or one of the big takeaways, just to put a statement around it, is we start off with everyone freaking out and saying, oh my God, all the jobs are going to go. We end up with a very difficult transition period where a lot of jobs are lost and a lot of people are displaced, and there's a lot of societal unrest. We end up with a period of more jobs with people working fewer hours and a higher standard of living for all of society. And so that's the arc we've gone through 3 times. To think that it's going to be different this time, it's possible, but we are clearly in the beginning of the freak out period where everyone says, oh my God, all the jobs are going to go. And we are about to enter, or in some countries certainly have entered, the societal disruption phase, where we have a lot of workers starting to get displaced, and those workers tend to become very nationalistic, tend to become very populist. And history shows us that the results of those things are very bad. And I look forward to maybe 20 years from now to the period where we have more jobs, people working fewer hours, and all of society having a higher standard of living.
That's great predictions. And I also love that your title is The End of Jobs. But then there's this little catchphrase, but not as you think it might be. Because you're right, everyone is freaking out, robotics, AI, everyone is taking our jobs. But it's actually not the case. Now, what have you seen in terms of the last probably 9 to 12 months since COVID-19 hit? What have been the biggest changes, and what do you think will that mean for 2021 and beyond?
It's such a great question. The short answer, and the one that nobody gives, by the way, but everybody should, is we don't know. There's not enough data yet for people to say, oh, everyone's going to go remote. No, they're not all going to go to remote. We're clearly not going to go back to where we were in terms of a remote workforce, but where in the middle will we end? We have what a lot of people are calling this tech acceleration, the increased adoption by consumers, by companies of digital work, of digital currencies, of digital payments, and a host of other things. But then when we get to a post-COVID world, God willing soon, there'll be a snapback. And we don't know how far back. I am highly, highly confident to say we're not going to go back fully to where we were, but I'm also equally confident in saying we're not going to stay where we are. So that's kind of the wishy-washy answer when we talk about the adoption of robots and AI systems, when we think about on-demand labor, when we think about remote work. Now, that said, surprising nobody, I will start with history. And let's just zero in on remote work because that's where we have the most data. 10 years ago, 1.5% of the US workforce worked remotely. And definitions are super important here because the definition of a remote worker is more than 50% of the time they don't go to that office. And that more than 50% is very important from a tax nexus standpoint, where you're going to pay tax, and from a office infrastructure standpoint, right? If you're not coming in, you're only coming in 20% of the time, I'm going to hot desk you or hotel desk you. I'm not going to allocate infrastructure to you. So very important definitions, and 1.5% of the US workforce, and pretty confident that that was about the level in other industrialized countries. And over a 10-year period, we had a 100% increase. It went up to 3%. What's fascinating is in the world of labor statistics, for those of us that spend their free time looking at labor statistics and reading outputs from different countries' labor organizations, labor statistics move really slow. And so to see something double is unusual. But it did double, and it doubled because of Zoom or WebEx or a host of other video conferencing technologies. It doubled because of Jira or Basecamp or Monday or other project management softwares that made it easier to work with a disparate team. And so those things enabled a push towards greater work. And it was held back by antiquated mindsets. We all know the manager that says, oh, I don't care, all the studies tell me that remote workers are happier, healthier, more productive, more engaged. I think people need to be in the office. I think productivity equals presence. So we all know that. That's the first impediment, mindset. And the second is infrastructure, policies, and procedures. It's one thing to say you can work remotely. It's another to really enable your employee to be successful, to make sure that there's always a remote option for every meeting, to make sure they can access all of the company's systems, even outside of the company's four walls. So those were the things kind of holding it back. And in the pandemic, both of those things had to change immediately. March of 2020, everybody had to change their mindset. Everybody had to change their policies, procedures, and put in place the infrastructure to enable remote work. And so at the height of the pandemic, most countries were at their natural limit for the people that can work remote. And it's important to remember what a natural limit is. In Australia, I believe the natural limit's about 37%. In the EU, it's about 38, 39%. In the United States, it's 42%. That is the percent of the workforce that can work remotely. Because clearly people in manufacturing and extraction industries, in transportation and logistics, I can't be a coal miner from my house. I actually have to go to the coal mine. And so most countries were near their natural limit. But when we think about post-pandemic, and we look at the surveys of managers and we look at surveys of workers, and we start to get a sense that maybe 8% of the workforce is going to work remotely. Again, remembering definitions are important here, remote only meaning more than 50% of the time. If you ask me how many people have a flexible work arrangement, it starts to look like 32, 33% of the workforce. And again, these are both in the US, and keeping in mind, 42% is the most that can work remote. So you're talking about upwards of 75% of people having a flexible work arrangement. Those are huge shifts. Those are clearly driven by COVID. If we had not had this pandemic, these things would not have occurred. So I don't think we're staying at the 40%. I don't think we're going back to the 8% for fully remote workers, 32 to 33% for flexible work arrangements.
That's such an interesting approach on how to look at it. And this is also what fascinates me so much about the future of work. It's not one thing, there's not one prediction, it's just constantly evolves and changes. But at the same time, this ongoing change and not quite knowing what's next is also what scares people, and they're not sure what to do next. We've seen over the last 12 months, a lot of companies have reduced their staff, have reduced their office space, and a lot of people have lost their jobs and they had to transition. And you're also talking about reskilling and upskilling. Now, where do you see in terms of the way how we learn, how we can see what's next, what's an important skill? How can we prepare ourselves for what's next when we don't know what's next?
Well, first, there are a few thoughts here. First is you need to be thoughtful in thinking about what's next, right? You can't just take someone's prediction and go, oh my gosh, that's what's going to happen, because most predictions aren't thoughtful. They're not looking at history. They're not looking at data. They're not looking at how companies actually engage workers. So be mindful of what predictions you're reacting to. That said, to your point, retraining and reskilling are key here. They're absolutely key. And I will tell you, there's a phrase that a lot of people are kind of getting sick of. They're like, oh God, people are saying that too much. And I would make the argument, we are not saying it nearly enough, and that is everyone needs to be a lifelong learner. Because regardless of what that change is, what we know is the amount of time in which a skill abates, in which a skill becomes non-monetizable, has shrunk. We now think it's 4 to 6 years, that if you do no incremental training within 4 to 6 years, you're no longer competitive in that marketplace. So to the extent that everybody is not upskilling, everybody's not reskilling, people are going to have a problem, regardless of whether or not your job is at a substantive risk of being completely automated away. So it's not a upskill in that industry, because that industry and that job function's dead. It is a complete reskill into another industry. So even if you don't have to do a complete reskill, you're always going to have to do an upskill. And so those are things for everyone to be thoughtful of, and everyone to look at what is happening in your industry. Think about, is this prediction a real prediction? But regardless, whether you're upskilling or reskilling, you are skilling again in some way.
Absolutely. And 4 to 6 years, it actually seems like a very long time, given in marketing world, every 2 seconds there's a new social media platform popping out, or, new emojis, new ways. Like a few weeks ago, TikTok and the Reels were a big thing. Now everyone is on Clubhouse and nobody talks about Reels and TikTok anymore, even though it's still a trend. So that's a really interesting insight. And also be more mindful, because I feel that the future of work is more self-initiated, self-driven, and you need to take control over your own growth. You can't rely on a manager or HR teams to give you the path, because there's no one linear path. And also the gig economy has been, quote unquote, a trend for the last few years. What do you think about that? Is that something that we see more often, that people are more entrepreneurial, run their own business, or is it still that we have got full-time employees?
Such a great question, and I love the way you framed it, because you are referencing something that is a main point of the book. And let's start with this. The gig economy, or the gig economy is a subset of the on-demand economy. On-demand economy meaning everyone doing a job for you that is not your W-2 employee. So it could be a temp, it could be a freelancer, a contractor, a consultant, whatever you want to call it. That has not been growing that much. Everyone's like, oh my God, the on-demand economy, it's going to be half the labor force. No, it isn't. That's a ridiculous statement. Stop making it. And yet people still continue to make it. People made it 10 years ago, and they said by 2020, 50% of the workforce is going to be on demand. It was at the time between 25 and 27% in the EU and the US. It is now somewhere between 27 and 30% in the EU and the US, and I would include Australia in that. And so it's grown, and just to grow 1% of a labor force the size of the EU or the US or the industrialized countries, that's huge, 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 huge change. But it's not doubling in a 10-year period. That is full stop not going to happen. So, okay, we've had some slow and steady growth. But here is why I named the book The End of Jobs, Rise of On-Demand Workers. The rise of the on-demand worker is not to say that we're all going to be an on-demand worker. The data is very clear. There will be some slow and steady continued growth of on-demand work over the next 10 years, maybe another percent or two of the labor force. That's it. That's what the data, and that's what history, and that's what how companies actually engage workers would tell us. But the things that the on-demand worker deals with, to your point, having to own their own training, their own development, their own retirement, their own healthcare. Right? If I am a Uber driver, I know Uber's not looking out for me. Uber's not retraining me for another job. Uber's not worried about me marketing my skills. Uber's not worried about my retirement or my healthcare. I have to worry about that. I have to deal with the fact that I get work in tasks, right? Work comes in one little assignment at a time. That's what a freelancer deals with, or an Uber driver. I have to deal with the fact that algorithms allocate my work. There's no boss to go out to lunch with and be like, hey, I really want to work more on this type of stuff versus that. An algorithm tells me if I get a job or not. I have data-driven HR. Everything that I do is tracked, and all of those data points tell me if, or inform if I get another job. And so all of those things that the freelancer, that Uber driver has to deal with every single day, those are all permeating the full-time workforce. And so while I don't think everyone's going to become an Uber driver or a freelancer or a consultant or a contingent worker or whatever, I think they all will have to deal with increased or total personal responsibility for training, development, healthcare, retirement, marketing of skills. I think everyone's got to deal with task-based labor. I think everyone's got to deal with data-driven HR. I think everybody's got to deal with algorithms allocating work. Not today, but over the next decade or two, that will become a standard for every worker. And that's what I mean by rise of on-demand workers.
This is such a great explanation, and I've actually never heard it like that, but this is exactly what people are seeing already, because especially the younger workforce, they want to have the cake and eat it too, meaning they want to have flexible work environments, they want to work from home, they want to work on their terms and so forth. But at the same time, that also means that you have to take the responsibilities that come with all the flexibilities and the freedom, and you need to invest in yourself. No HR person, no boss is in charge of your development. So you need to think more entrepreneurial, and also being able to be agile with your career and shift maybe within the corporation, saying my job or my skill set is not relevant anymore simply because there's no demand. So what else can I use my skill set and my experience and my education for? Or where do I need to upskill to create value to stay relevant in the organization?
Completely. And every freelancer in the world knows that, right? They know if they're not out there hustling and doing something, the work's going to dry up. And so
Exactly.
everybody's got to have that mindset. Everybody, everybody, everybody.
And maybe it's a good time now to shift gears and look at it from the corporation side of things. So you also, the second part of the title is Agile Corporations or Agile Companies. What does that mean? What kind of changes will we see in organizations based on those work trends?
So what we're seeing is companies understanding that there's convergence and starting to manage their workforce with data-driven HR, with algorithms to allocate work and things like that. And they are starting to break work down into its component tasks so they can break it up. That allows them to think, what are all the different resources that can do work for me? And so companies are starting to take a view of what we'll call total talent management, where they're thinking about their full-time employees, their part-time employees, their temp employees, their freelance employees, their vendors, their robots, their AI systems, their drones, anybody or anything that can complete a task. And they want all of those things in one system. And they want to have the work broken down into tasks. They want an AI engine to allocate work across their entire labor plane to any of those labor resources we just walked through. They want data captured on that task so that the AI system knows the next time, do I send that same task to that same people or should we adjust? And so that is how you build an agile corporation, by taking an entire view of your labor force and slowly over time allocating more to on-demand resources where possible from a business process standpoint and from a regulatory standpoint. That's what the agile corporation means.
That's a good view on also looking into every resource there is. It's not just human resource, it's technology resources, whatever other resources that can do the job, to look at that. Now, what does it mean in terms of HR? Will it be an obsolete profession? Will it change? What's your predictions?
I don't think HR ever becomes obsolete. HR is actually one of the many job functions when we look at all the studies that break down granular job functions and what the predictions are based on technologies, based on industry trends. HR is one of the job functions that you always see job growth in. Just always, 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 every single study that I've seen in the going forward. So I'm not concerned about the HR professional, but to your point, what does that job start to look like? Well, when I think about total talent management, now all of a sudden I have to have HR become an important strategic partner in planning my entire labor resource world. They used to really just be focused on full-time and a little bit on part-time. But the HR department's going to have to start owning temp, going to have to start owning freelance, going to have to start owning parts of the supply chain because we're going to have to start taking the view that these are all my team members. I want them aligned with my mission. I want them aligned with my values. And I want to know, are they producing? And if they're aligned with my mission, if they're aligned with my values, and they're producing effectively and efficiently, I want to get them more work. And so HR is going to have to become a partner in that, point one. Point two, HR is going to have to look at that total talent management landscape. They're going to have to look and say, where do I have skills gaps? And where do I need to use recruiting resources to fill the skills gaps? And where should I use training and development resources to fill the skills gaps? Because you're suddenly in this total talent management world going to have a very, very robust view of the entire skills capabilities overlaid with the geographic capabilities, overlaid with the availability of all of your labor resources. And so you'll in real time be able to know, do we have enough resources to take on this new client, this new project, this new whatever? And the answer to that question is going to be HRs. Do we have the human resources to handle the demand that we have over the next quarter, over the next year, over the next 5 years? And if not, HR, how are we going to fill it? Are we going to fill it with full-time workers, with part-time workers, with temps, with freelancers? Are we going to fill it by upskilling our workforce? Are we going to fill it by reskilling? Are we going to fill it with more recruiting? Those are the kinds of things that HR is going to need to be thoughtful about.
It's actually taking a much bigger look and also more strategic look rather than just being a payroll assistant. HR needs to take more responsibility in terms of how can we grow the organization sustainably with our human resources and maximize that. In terms of upskilling and reskilling, over the last few months, especially because of COVID, a lot of organizations have gotten rid of their internal learning and development teams because they're not a core function. And it's a bit of a luxury, quote unquote, to have that internally. What do you see in terms of how we actually train our teams and also ourselves? Is it, where do you see the future of learning going to be?
It's such an interesting thing to think through because the short answer is we don't know. We know what history and data would tell us. History and data would tell us that the average number of dollars spent per employee for training and development has massively decreased. It has continued to decrease. You hear about some great examples of some great companies that are doing wonderful things for their employees, but they're stories because they're anomalous. The fact that Starbucks might be doing X, Y, or Z, or Walmart's doing X, Y, or Z, ADP's doing X, Y, or Z. They're great stories, and those companies are doing well by their people, but they're stories because they're so rare. So where that goes is so interesting. One of my favorite parts of the book or quotes in the book is a joke, and the joke is, the CEO, the CFO says to the CEO, well, what if we train all these people and they leave? And the CEO says, what if we don't and they stay? And so you need to be mindful of it. And I'm hopeful that training and development budgets will go back up, but I'm more hopeful in emerging technologies like VR headsets that enable people to do training and development and skills attainment at a massively reduced cost, at a massively reduced amount of time. And so that leaves me incredibly hopeful.
And I hope so too, because one of the biggest motivators and reasons why employees join an organization is because of the learning and development opportunities and their growth in their own role. Everyone takes a current role for the next step. Nobody's naturally thinking of what's in it for me right now, what's in it for me down the track, and where can this experience and this exposure get me to. And this is what so many organizations don't realize. And you said, I love this quote too, what if they stay and we've become a stagnant, lame organization who are not thinking forward? The world is not stopping, clearly. If we're stopping, the game is over. Now, everyone needs to get your book. But Jeff, what's next for you? What have you got planned for 2021?
Ooh, what have I got planned for 21? Well, I had the great fortune of being purchased by one of the great companies in the world, ADP. I gave my word that I would stay for a certain period of time post-acquisition. That period of time just ended a few months ago. I'm going to, for the first time, do nothing. I'll do nothing for a while. I'm going to think through what I want my next company to be. WorkMarket was my third startup, and so I am going to do another. And it's going to take me some time to not only think about it, but to get past the non-compete that I have with ADP, which doesn't allow me to do really anything in HR tech, which I'm more than happy to do because and I remain an advisor to the team at ADP. They're not only, the best company in HR, the biggest human capital management software provider, but they're like the nicest people in the world. And so I look forward to working with them as partners in my next company.
Well, I'm sure you're not getting bored with all the projects that you've going on, and you're always forward-thinking approach. So I'm really looking forward to following your journey. Now, to wrap up, what advice would you give us in terms of how can we future-proof ourselves? You already said that we need to look around, that we need to look into where does the data come from and the predictions. What kind of tangible, practical advice could you give us as to where do we start to realize what are those changes?
Well, I would say you need to start by thinking about history, about data, about how companies engage workers instead of just reacting. I think a lot of people react to headlines and, oh my God, 50% of jobs are going to go. No, they're not. And that's the place to start, is to engage your critical thinking skills when thinking about the future of work, the future of anything. The next place to go is, where are the training organizations within your industry, within your job function? Because, and you made this point earlier, you can't rely on your manager. You can't rely on your company. It's great if they do. If your company is great at training and development, if your manager is the kind of manager that sits with you and talks about your professional development goals quarter by quarter, that is amazing. You're in the vast minority of workers. For workers to sit there and not be proactive about it, to not join the different industry organizations, functional organizations, and get that training and development and be up on new technologies, you are doing yourself a disservice. So the functional and the practical advice, find out what those organizations are, join them, and start reading and start listening and start getting ready for a future that is going to look very different than the present.
That's such a great approach. And, in the end, it comes back to being curious about it and not just letting everything happen to you, but asking those questions, putting yourself out there. And then also what you mentioned, critical thinking, not just taking one statistic, one number totally out of context for the truth, the one and only truth, but actually question it. What does it mean for me? Does it have any impact? And if so, what can I do? And this is also coming back to taking the driver's seat of your career and your future. No one else does it. And if you leave it up to somebody else, well, don't be upset if it's not going the right direction.
No question. Look, if you leave the driving up to somebody else, don't be surprised as to where you end up.
Exactly. So I'm super excited about what the future of work brings, because it's in our hands, and we are really excited to dig deeper into your work. Definitely, I put the show notes, the book into the show notes. Everyone can check that out. And also, where's the best way to connect with you and follow what's next for Jeff Wald?
I will say Twitter is the only place where I go by Jeffrey. I didn't get on there early enough to get Jeff Wald, but LinkedIn is always going to be the best place to connect. I'm a huge fan of LinkedIn. It is the one social network that I actually spend time on.
Now, that's a new question. Are you in Clubhouse?
I am on Clubhouse, and I started a thread on Clubhouse the other day, and I forgot to check back to see if anybody's picked it up and is talking about it. I have been on Clubhouse for some time, but much like I'm on Signal and I am on Instagram and I'm on all these things, it is not something that I spend a lot of time on.
You
Not
maybe
yet,
should.
anyway.
Yes, I totally got hooked there because of those incredible minds and conversations. And what I love about this innovation of a social media platform is that it's actually social. It's not curated. It's not looking at pretty pictures and have no message there. You can't hide because it's all voice only, and people are listening. So they are even more alert as to what you're saying rather than getting distracted or what it looks like and those pretty pictures. So I'm definitely going to follow you, and hopefully we can even have a bit of a chat there as to what the future of work looks like and share your message with more people.
I would do that anytime you want, and that would be my first Clubhouse chat. So you tell me when, I'll be there.
Oh, you will love it. You'll get hooked, I promise. Well, thanks so much for being here, and I can't wait to seeing what's next for you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was super fun.
Thank you.